the Moirai's threads frayed at the edges, their once gleaming strands dulled by the weight of mortal defiance. Olympus, its spires veiled in ash and memory, stood as a relic of a fading epoch. The gods' breaths grew shallow, their thunderous voices reduced to whispers drowned by the clamor of human ambition. Mortals no longer lifted their eyes to the heavens, but inward, to the flickering light of reason and the quiet rebellion of their own hands. This is the twilight of the divine, a saga of dissolution, where myths crumble into dust and the cosmos learns to beat with mortal hearts. The cosmos held its breath when Eris, goddess of discord, plucked a star from the firmament and forged it into an apple. Its skin gleamed with the venom of 1,000 serpentine thoughts, the words to the fairest etched in celestial fire. At the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, where gods and mortals mingled like oil and water, she cast her creation onto the marble floor. It rolled, a golden ember of chaos, until it settled at the feet of Paris, Prince of Troy, a shepherd turned pawn, his palms still reeking of soil and sheep's wool. Aphrodite's whisper reached him first, slithering through the feast's clamor like smoke. "Helen of Sparta," she murmured, her voice a siren's sigh. Her lips are the color of pomegranate seeds, her hair a cascade of midnight. She will etch your name into history between her thighs. Hera's offer followed, cold and metallic. Empires of jade and gold, cities that will chant your name long after your bones turn to dust. Athena's gift cut sharpest, wisdom's blade, to carve truth from the rot of mortal delusion. Paris, his heart a hollow drum, chose lust. The gods, ever petty, let the choice fester. For a decade Troy became their stage. Apollo cloaked himself in armor polished to a mirror's sheen, the better to reflect his fading glory. His arrows, fletched with feathers torn from Leto's sacred swans, carried plague distilled from his mother's tears. By night, he whispered to Hector, Troy's golden prince, of undying honor, a lie that curdled on the tongue. Your name will blaze brighter than the stars, he vowed, as Hector's wife Andromache cradled their son, Astyanax, in the citadel's shadows, her eyes twin pools of unshed grief. By day, Apollo's shafts pierced Greek flesh, their corpses swelling under the Anatolian sun, skin peeling like parchment to reveal meat for carrion crows. Athena, ever the strategist, haunted Odysseus's dreams. Her voice was the scrape of a whetstone on bronze, the hiss of a blade being honed. Build a horse, she urged, hollow as the gods' promises, fill its belly with blood. She sharpened Diomedes' guile, guiding his dagger to slit the throats of Trojan allies mid-prayer, their offerings to Zeus still smoking on makeshift altars. Ares, god of war, waded into the fray with the subtlety of a landslide, his roar splitting the Scamander's banks. River nymphs fled into the silt as he bathed in the reddening currents, his laughter a thunderclap. But mortals had grown teeth. Diomedes, king of Argos, drove his spear into Ares' thigh. The god's ichor, thick, gold, and reeking of sulfur, spilled across the plains, searing the soil into jagged glass. Ares fled, howling to Olympus, his divinity leaking like wine from a cracked amphora. The earth drank his blood, sprouting thorns that would one day strangle temples built in his name. Zeus, enthroned in clouds and false neutrality, watched Achilles' rage eclipse divine design. The hero's grief for Patroclus was no cosmic script, but a raw, human inferno. He dragged Hector's corpse behind his chariot, the stench of rot clinging to the wheels, vultures circling like crooked halos. When Priam, Troy's broken king, crept into the Greek camp under Nyx's cloak, his hands trembled not from fear, but revelation. He clasped Achilles' knees, his voice a rasp. You are more God than they. You bleed, you break, you feel. They are only echoes. The hero's tears fell not for Hector, nor Patroclus, but for the frailty the gods had forced upon mortals. You are all ghosts, he hissed to the sky, and I am the only real thing here. The wooden horse, Athena's gift, birthed horrors even the Furies would blanch to name. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, cornered Priam at the altar of Zeus Herkios, where the old king had once slaughtered white bulls in better days. The boy's blade soared through tendon and bone, Priam's blood pooling around the sacred fire until it sputtered into ash. Astyanax, Hector's infant heir, was torn from Andromache's arms, his skull dashed against Troy's stones like a pomegranate bursting with seeds. The Greeks, once men, became wolves, their howls echoing through streets choked with ash and entrails, their faces smeared with gore that would never wash clean. Hecuba, once queen of Troy, clawed at the hull of Odysseus's ship as it carried her to slavery. Her curses, sharp as shards of broken prophecy, etched themselves into the wood. Let your homecoming rot, let your wife forget your face, let your son spit on your name. Her words would fester in the timbers, blooming into the cyclones that shattered his fleet and the sirens that gnawed at his resolve. The gods retreated, their thrones gathering dust. Aphrodite wept over Helen's scarred beauty on the shores of Rhodes, her tears dissolving into the Aegean as saltwater pearls. Apollo snapped his silver bow over his knee, burying its halves beneath Delphi's slopes, where future priests would dig them up and call them oracles. Zeus stared at his thunderbolt, its lightning dimmed to a sputter, and wondered if this was how Cronus had felt. Old, obsolete, a relic waiting for the next usurper. In the ruins of Troy, a child scavenged a shard of Apollo's shattered bow. He pressed it to his ear, hearing not prophecy, but the sea's indifferent roar. Far to the west, a Mycenaean scribe etched the war's end on a clay tablet. Gods absent, men monstrous, truth uncertain. The tablet baked in the sun, forgotten, until a farmer's plough unearthed it 3 millennia later, its words crumbling to dust in the wind. The Olympians, once architects of fate, were now relics in a world where heroes wrote their own endings. The sea had become a mirror of Odysseus's unraveling soul, its waves no longer thrashing with Poseidon's wrath, but lapping with the indifference of a predator sated. 10 years adrift had leached the colour from his beard, salt crusting its strands into brittle cords, while his eyes, once sharp as Athena's owl, mirrored the dull sheen of weathered bronze. The horizon blurred into a smudge of grey, the line between sky and water, dissolving like the gods' fading authority. The Cyclops cave yawned in the cliffs of Sicily, its walls slick with the blood of half-digested men. Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, loomed in the gloom, his single eye a milky orb veined with ruptured capillaries. The monster's laughter shook stalactites loose as he devoured Odysseus's men, their screams echoing not with divine justice, but the crude satisfaction of a beast. Odysseus offered wine in a jug blistered by its own corrosive vintage, watching the Cyclops collapse into stupor. The stake they drove into his eye was no sacred olive branch, but a splintered mast from their shattered ship, its tip charred in the same fire that had roasted their comrades. The Cyclops' curse hung in the air like brine, redundant against the sea's hollowed silence. Circe's palace sprawled like a cancer, its walls crawling with vines that pulsed as though breathing. Her beasts, lions with human eyes, wolves that wept like widows, prowled the halls, their whines harmonizing with the screams of Odysseus's transformed crew. The sorceress herself was a mirage of beauty, her lips stained with pomegranate, her fingers trailing poisons that turned men into swine. Odysseus drank her draughts like water, his veins thick with she-nean of salt and spite. He pressed her dagger to her throat, the blade trembling not with fear but exhaustion. Circe's defiance crumbled into fascination as she unraveled her loom, its threads weaving visions of Scylla's 6 serpentine heads and Charybdis's whirlpool throat. The siren's reef loomed white with the bones of poets. Their song slithered through the wax, clogging his crew's ears, its melody unspooling Odysseus's deepest shame. The son he'd left squalling in Ithaca, the wife whose face blurred like a rain-smeared fresco. Lashed to the mast, he strained against his bonds, the ropes biting into flesh as the siren's lies coiled around his heart. Blood mingled with salt spray when he bit through his lip to stay silent, the rocks ahead sharp with the skeletons of better men. Scylla struck at dawn. 6 serpents lashed from the cliffs, their jaws unhinging like bear traps. She snatched 6 men, Eurylochus dying mid-scream as her smallest head's gullet swallowed him whole. Odysseus, sword drawn, did nothing. Circe's warning rang cold and clear in his skull. He met Scylla's central gaze, her pupil a maelstrom of ancient grief, and saw the truth. She was no monster but Hecate's discarded daughter, twisted by divine neglect. The ship veered into the whirlpool's periphery, the crew's wails haunting the strait long after the waves stilled. Charybdis's maw swallowed them whole. Timbers splintered, men vanished into the froth, and Odysseus clung to a fig tree's roots, the last gift of a nameless dryad. The maelstrom spat him onto Ogygia, where Calypso awaited, her beauty a weapon dulled by time. Her island was a prison of eternal sunsets, the sky bleeding hues of amber and bruise. She offered immortality, her voice a lullaby woven from stolen stars. Odysseus stared at the horizon, where the first light of Ithaca flickered like a dying ember. When he finally beached on his homeland's shores, the god's fingerprints had faded. Athena appeared not in a blaze of glory, but as a beggar girl, her feet caked with road dust. She gestured to his hall, its air thick with the stench of suitors and rot. Odysseus, his skin leathered by sun and salt, turned away. The slaughter was methodical, mundane. No thunder applauded as he strung his bow, no owls hooted as the suitor's blood pooled on the flagstones. Penelope met his gaze not with tears but a smirk, her unraveled shroud a tapestry of false promises at her feet. Telemachus buried the dead without ritual, quicklime and silence his only rites. That night Odysseus climbed to Ithaca's highest crag and hurled his sword into the sea. The waves swallowed it whole. Poseidon, watching from the depths, felt his trident tremble. The sea had birthed empires, drowned cities, nursed leviathans, yet this mortal's defiance left no ripple. The god retreated into the abyss, his rage spent. In a Mycenaean tomb, centuries later, archaeologists would find a child's doll stuffed with papyrus. Scrawled in Linear B, Father returned. Gods silent. We are free. Athens reeked of burnt olive oil and the metallic tang of unwashed ambition. The Acropolis, once crowned with temples oozing sacrificial smoke, now hunched under the weight of crumbling marble, its cracks filled with the whispers of men who traded thunderbolts for syllogisms. Socrates, barefoot and reeking of sour wine, paced the cracked floors of the agora, his shadow stretching like a question mark across the sun-baked stones. His gaze dissected the world, the vendors hawking amulets of Hermes, the farmers bartering curses disguised as prayers, and found it wanting. The gods had become footnotes, their temples repurposed as storehouses for grain and greed. The Eleusinian mysteries, once a crescendo of divine terror, devolved into farce. Pilgrims no longer trembled at Demeter's wrath but purchased sacred barley cakes from hucksters, their coins clattering into purses lined with false piety. In the Dionysian theatre, actors donned masks of Zeus and Hera, reducing their affairs to bawdy jokes. The crowd roared as a comedian tripped over a prop thunderbolt, his mock Olympian pratfall met with peals of laughter that rattled the rotting rafters. Socrates' trial unfolded like a scripted tragedy. The jurors, fishmongers, cobblers, men whose hands stank of yesterday's labor, shifted uneasily as Anytus, the Tanna politician, accused him of corrupting youth. The charge hung in the air, a stale relic of a dead pantheon. Socrates sipped hemlock from a clay cup, his eyes alight with a fire no god had kindled. The poison coiled through his veins, a cold serpent, as he gestured to the frescoes peeling from the walls, Zeus raping Europa, Apollo flaying Marsyas. "These are your paragons?" his silence asked. The jurors looked away. In his cell, Plato brought figs and a stolen scroll of Heraclitus, its edges singed by the dying embers of a philosopher's hearth. Socrates traced the words, "No man steps in the same river twice," and laughed, the sound echoing off walls that had heard too many final breaths. When the hemlock clenched his heart, he died mid-sentence, his corpse curving into a cipher future scholars would dissect for millennia. Plato fled to Sicily, where sulfur pits belched their yellow venom into skies starved of stars. In a limestone cave, its walls scarred by ancient tides, he carved his allegory of the cave with a chisel stolen from a mason's corpse. The shadows danced in torchlight, their forms warping as he lectured to shepherds who spat at his feet. One herdsman, clutching a Mycenaean figurine of a lion-eyed goddess, sneered. The philosopher's words, like the gods themselves, could not fill an empty belly. Aristotle, Plato's pupil, waded into tidal pools, his hands slick with eel slime. He dissected the creatures under the Lyceum's colonnades, their entrails glistening in the sun. "No soul here," he declared, holding up a thrashing specimen. "Only mechanics." His students, sons of blacksmiths and bakers, scribbled notes on wax tablets, their styluses scratching out a new liturgy. Observe, reason, prove. Beneath their feet, Gaia stirred. Her mountains had been gutted for marble to clad senators' villas. Her forests fed the furnaces of Athenian bathhouses. In Thessaly, the earth cracked like an egg, sulphurous steam hissing from fissures that glowed with primordial rage. Typhon, her monstrous son, writhed in his volcanic prison, his 100 serpent heads gnawing at chains forged from Zeus's rusted lightning. "Rise!" Gaia commanded, her voice a tectonic groan. "Crush their arrogance. Remind them I birthed them." The earth convulsed, temples toppled into gaping maws, aqueducts vomited dust. In Delphi, the Pythia choked on fumes that reeked of rotting eggs, her prophecies devolving into screams. "The earth hungers," she shrieked, her nails clawing at the cracked omphalos. Priests fled, their gold-leafed robes snagging on brambles that erupted from the soil like Gaia's vengeful fingers. Plato, now an old man, felt the quake in his marrow. He stood in his academy's courtyard, clutching Aristotle's treatise on metaphysics, as the ground buckled. "The gods are dead," he murmured, "but the earth is alive." The Olympians convened in a hall of crumbling cloud. Zeus's beard had greyed, his thunderbolt corroded to a lump of pitted iron. Hera's peacocks molted, their iridescent feathers trampled underfoot. Apollo plucked a lyre string, it snapped with a whimper. Poseidon's trident trembled as he growled, "We stopped the Titans once. Can we—" "No," Athena interrupted. Her owl perched on a fractured column, one wing dangling by a tendon. "We are spent, let the mortals fight her," and fight they did. Alexander, a Macedonian king with a philosopher's mind and a butcher's hands, marched east. His engineers drilled into the earth, siphoned Typhon's geothermal fury, and weaponized it. Rivers of Greek fire incinerated villages. Gaia's screams echoed through molten rock. In Babylon, Alexander drank himself to death, his empire fracturing like a clay jug. But the message was etched into the scorched earth. Mortals bend nature. Mortals defy fate. Mortals inherit. Epicurus planted a garden where disciples gorged on figs and mocked the heavens. "Gods!" "Lazy landlords," he sneered, tossing a Mycenaean fertility idol into a well. The splash echoed through the silence left by Olympus. In Rhodes, a sculptor chiseled Helios's Colossus over the harbour. The bronze giant's face bore his own likeness, a mortal smirk cast in metal. Gaia's final breath seeped from a Thessalian cave, her roots retracting into the abyss. The Titans, half-roused, sank back into magma. The Fates snipped her thread. Plato's cave allegory, copied onto papyrus and smuggled to Alexandria, was catalogued under metaphor, not myth. In a Roman villa centuries later, a child unearthed a statue of Socrates, its chipped nose and probing eyes preserved under volcanic ash. "Who's that?" his sister asked. "A man who killed gods," he said. The earth did not answer. The fumes rising from Delphi's fissure had thinned to a spectral wisp, the once potent vapors now little more than the sigh of a dying god. Lyra, the final Pythia, knelt in the Adyton, the sacred chamber beneath Apollo's temple, her lungs starved of the divine madness that once sent priestesses writhing in prophetic ecstasy. The bronze tripod, its legs warped by centuries of celestial heat, sank into cracks webbing the chamber floor, like roots reclaiming a corpse. Above her, the temple's roof gaped open to a pitiless sky, its shattered columns casting skeletal shadows over the omphalos, the navel stone that once marked Delphi as the world's pulsing heart. The priests no longer anointed her with laurel oil or fed her sacred bay leaves. Instead, they tossed stale barley cakes and brackish water into the chamber, their faces hollow masks of resignation. The high priest's scrolls of pre-written prophecies lay scattered at her feet, their ink smudged by the sweat of desperate hands. Victory, legacy, honor, words as empty as the coffers of Apollo's forsaken treasury. Apollo's absence festered in the air. His golden lyre, strung with sunlight in an age long petrified, hung shrouded in cobwebs. The sacred laurel tree, its roots once nourished by Python's ichor, shed brittle leaves that crunched underfoot like the bones of forgotten supplicants. Even the Castalian spring, where pilgrims once scrubbed their sins raw, had dwindled to a brackish trickle. Lyra dipped her hands into its murk, whispering the old invocations, but the water stayed silent. The Romans arrived at noon, their armor clanking like a death knell. Lucius Verinius, a general with a conqueror's beard and a banker's eyes, demanded legitimacy for his campaign in Macedonia. The priests scrambled to placate him, their voices trembling as they brandished scrolls of hollow promises. Lyra pressed her palms to the tripod's cold metal, groping in the dark for a truth that refused to surface. "You will cross a river," she intoned, the words ash in her mouth. "Your enemies will falter." Lucius sneered, spitting on the omphalos before storming out. The stone split clean down the middle, its halves collapsing into the fissure like a closing eye. That night the earth shuddered, not in rage, but resignation. The Pleistos River ran red with clay from collapsed shrines, its currents choked with the debris of fallen idols. Villagers fled, clutching household gods carved in the crude likenesses of Roman deities, their Greek names sanded away by time. Lyra dragged the tripod to a cave on Mount Parnassus, its walls painted with Mycenaean spirals older than Delphi itself. With the last of Apollo's vapors clawing her throat, she channeled a final prophecy. Not for Rome, but for the earth. The gods are not dead, they are bored. They've moved on to newer worlds, leaving us to drown in their toys. The tripod toppled, its legs snapping like kindling. Lyra buried it beneath a cairn of stones, each etched with a dead god's name. Centuries later, a French archaeologist would unearth it, mistaking the scorch marks on its surface for patina. Tourists in the Louvre would snap photographs, oblivious to the whispers trapped in its bronze. In Delphi, the fissure sealed itself. A farmer planted olives where the Adyton had been. His grandchildren pressed the fruit into oil that tasted faintly of sulfur. On the summer solstice, when the light slanted just so, the ruins hummed with a sound like a lyre string plucked by the wind. A child, visiting on a school trip, picked up a shard of the shattered omphalos. "Did the gods really live here?" she asked. The teacher adjusted her replica necklace, its beads mimicking Roman-era glass. "No, but the stories were pretty." The museum stood as a mausoleum of myths, its marble halls echoing with the hollow laughter of gods reduced to exhibits. Dust motes drifted through shafts of pallid light, settling on statues with chipped noses and sightless eyes. Helios's chariot, now a skeletal husk of bronze, loomed in the atrium, its horses frozen mid-gallop, their legs snapped at the knees. A placard at their feet read, "Apollo's Sun Chariot, 3rd century BCE, loaned from the Louvre." No one mentioned the cracks where mortal hands had clumsily repaired divine craftsmanship. A school group clustered around Zeus's thunderbolt, its once jagged lightning bolts blunted by time. The teacher, a woman with a voice like dry parchment, recited dates and provenance. The children fidgeted, their eyes glazing over as she droned about Hellenistic influences and ritual significance. One boy, his fingers sticky from candy, reached out to touch the relic. The guard barked a warning, and the child jerked back, his sneaker scuffing the mosaic floor, a Mycenaean spiral, its pattern fractured by centuries of footfalls. In the Mycenaean wing, glass cases displayed clay tablets etched with Linear B, Diwo and Posi da Zeus and Poseidon, their names reduced to phonetic curiosities. A graduate student hunched over a fragment labelled Unknown Cult Object, ca 1200 BCE, unaware it was a votive offering to Potnia, the lion-tamed goddess whose cult had drowned in Lethe's waters. Her thesis would argue it was a proto-monetary token, her footnotes burying the truth under academic jargon. The underworld exhibit lay in the basement, its air thick with the musk of neglect. Hades' helm of darkness, now a corroded lump, sat beside a donation box. A placard joked, "Please do not feed the Cerberus." Teenagers snapped selfies with grotesque Gorgon masks, their tongues lolling in mock terror. None noticed the faint scorch marks on the walls, traces of the Furies' last visit, when they'd raged against the indignity of being labelled allegorical art. Upstairs in the restoration lab, an intern scrubbed lichen from a statue of Demeter. The goddess's hands, once cradling sheaves of wheat, now gripped empty air. The intern hummed a pop song, her headphones drowning out the whispers trapped in the marble. Demeter's lips, parted in a silent scream, went unnoticed. At dusk, the museum emptied. Moonlight seeped through skylights, pooling around the Fates tapestry. A moth-eaten relic hung too close to a drafty window. Clotho's spindle lay snapped in its case, Lachesis' measuring rod stripped of its gold leaf. Atropos's shears, though, remained sharp, their edge glinting in the dark. Security cameras blinked red, unseeing, as the shears trembled. A thread snapped. In the suburbs, a dying man gasped, his hospice monitor flatlining. In a birthing ward, a newborn wailed. The fates, though unexhibited, still worked, their presence a rumor, a shiver in the curator's spine as she locked up for the night. A child returned the next day, slipping past the guards to press her ear against Apollo's lyre. The placard claimed it was non-functional, but she swore she heard a note, a high, thin sound, like a star collapsing. Her teacher scolded her, dragging her back to the bus. As the engine rumbled to life, the girl glanced back. The museum's windows flickered, shadows twisting into forms too tall for mortals. For a heartbeat, the statues straightened, their eyes gleaming with old fire. Then the bus turned the corner and the illusion shattered. The gods dissolved like salt in rain, their essence seeping into the cracks of mortal minds. What remained were not deities but metaphors, Zeus reduced to a synonym for power, Aphrodite a euphemism for lust, Hades a punchline about bureaucracy. Philosophers in Athens' Stoa debated their shadows, their arguments bouncing off marble walls where frescoes of titans once loomed. Aristotle paced the Lyceum's colonnades, his students scribbling notes about archetypes and prime movers, oblivious that their lectures were footnotes to a dead pantheon. In the olive groves of Arcadia, a shepherd named Leander carved symbols into tree trunks. His knife, bronze dulled by generations of use, bit into the bark with a rhythm older than language. He did not know the spiral he etched mirrored Potnia's sacred sigils, or that the jagged lines resembled Poseidon's trident. To him, they were markers, to find his way home, to ward off wolves. Yet when moonlight struck the grooves, the shadows they cast writhed like the Furies' hair. The Academy of Plato, now a shell of cracked plaster and weed-choked courtyards, housed rats and runaway slaves. In its former lecture hall, a mosaic of the Muses lay buried under goat dung. A lone scholar, Eudoxus, crouched in the rubble, brushing dust from a clay tablet. The Linear B script whispered of Diwo and Wanax, names as alien to him as the stars. He transcribed them into his scroll, labeling them pre-Socratic fiscal records, and never noticed the bloodstains flecking the edges. Offerings from a priestess long turned to ash. Leander's carvings deepened. The olive trees groaned as his blade peeled back their skin, sap oozing like ichor. One night, a traveller camped beneath the grove swore the symbols glowed, their lines pulsing like veins. By dawn, the man was gone, his ashes scattered by a wind that smelled of burnt myrrh. In Alexandria, the great library's archives swallowed myths whole. Callimachus, the head librarian, catalogued hymns to Apollo under agricultural almanacs and filed Demeter's rites as seasonal folk rituals. A scroll detailing Orpheus's descent into Hades was repurposed as packing material for Egyptian papyrus. Scholars pored over Herodotus's histories, dismissing his accounts of divine intervention as ethnographic hyperbole. The god's name survived only as prefixes, Theo in theology, Dis in disaster, linguistic fossils. Leander's grove became a shrine. Villagers left honeycakes and lamb's teeth at the trees, though none could say why. The symbols, now weathered and blurred, hummed when the north wind blew. A girl from the village pressed her ear to the bark and heard something like a heartbeat. Her mother dragged her home, scrubbing her skin with brine to purge the fairy nonsense. The fates worked in the margins. Clotho spun thread from the screams of dying cicadas. Lachesis measured the span of empires by the soot on Athenian chimneys. Atropos snipped the lines of poets who dared resurrect old names. Their shears flashed in the dark, unseen but felt, a chill down the spine of a playwright mid-soliloquy, a sudden silence in a marketplace where a bard began singing of Hera's jealousy. In Ephesus, a sculptor chiseled Artemis's likeness into a cedar log. The statue emerged with 6 breasts and a crown of bees, its eyes hollow pits. The temple priest declared it a masterpiece, though pilgrims flinched at its presence. When a drought shriveled the Cayster River, the statue was burned as a bad omen, its smoke reeking of ambrosia. Leander died in a winter storm, his body curled beneath his favorite olive tree. Villagers buried him with his knife clutched to his chest. By spring, the tree's roots had cracked his skull open, its branches heavy with fruit that tasted of salt and sorrow. A travelling philosopher, Xenophanes, stumbled upon the grove. He traced the carvings with ink-stained fingers, scoffing at the peasant superstitions. Yet that night he dreamt of wolves with stars for eyes, and a woman who wore the moon as a diadem. His treatise the next morning, on the folly of myth, quivered with uncharacteristic doubt. In Rome, augurs passed the entrails of geese for divine will, their knives slicing through organs already rotting from temple neglect. A child in the forum found a Mycenaean dagger half buried in mud, its blade etched with Potnia's lions. She traded it for a loaf of bread, unaware the baker melted it down to forge nails. The olive grove thrived in death. Leander's bones, cradled by roots, seeped into the soil like forgotten prayers. His carvings swelled with each passing storm, the grooves deepening into channels where rainwater pooled, reflecting stars that no longer held their names. Villagers avoided the grove at dusk, when the trees creaked in a language older than Greek, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Only the poet Xenophanes lingered, his sleep plagued by visions of wolves with star-streaked fur, and a woman whose voice unravelled his verses mid-scribble. By summer, the olives ripened black as Nyx's cloak, their flesh bitter with a salt that burned the tongue. The villagers pressed them into oil anyway, bottling the rancid liquid in clay jars stamped with Leander's crude spirals. The lamps fueled by this oil cast shadows that twitched when unobserved. A flicker of wings here, a serpent's coil there. A boy tending his father's sheep swore he saw Hermes in the flames, his caduceus bent, his smile a gash of embers. The villagers called it bad fuel and dumped the jars into the ravine, where the oil seeped into groundwater, tainting wells with whispers. Xenophanes, driven half mad by sleepless nights, penned his epic in the grove's heart. His ink was oak gall, mixed with his own blood, his parchment sheepskin stripped from a lamb born with human eyes. The poem sprawled, unspooling tales of a shepherd who carved gods into trees and a moon-clad woman who devoured stars. He did not recognize Leander in his verses, nor the goddess Selene in his metaphors. When he finished, his hands blistered, his quill reduced to a splinter. The villagers burned the manuscript, fearing its fevered cadences. The ash spiraled into the sky, seeding clouds with syllables that rained down as half-remembered hymns. In Athens, the academy's ruins birthed a new cult. Philosophers no longer debated ideals, but worshipped the grove's oil stains on their sandals. They called themselves Phytalius, the leaf-born, and drank infusions of bitter olives, chasing visions of Leander's knife. One acolyte, Theon, carved the spiral into his chest, the wound festering into a bloom of lichen. He died chanting Potnia's name, his corpse sprouting mushrooms that glowed like will-o'-wisps. The cult scattered, their robes stained with his spores, spreading the grove's whispers to ports as far as Syracuse and Carthage. The fates convened in a cobwebbed corner of a disused granary. Clotho's spindle was a splintered broomstick. Lachesis measured threads with a beggar's frayed rope. Atropos' shears, though, remained sharp. Their snip echoed in the gasp of a Theban midwife as a stillborn drew one breath, then none. They worked until their fingers bled, weaving Leander's legacy into the tapestry's edge. When dawn broke, the granary collapsed, burying them under wheat rotted by time. Mortals built a tannery atop the rubble. Unaware the fate's final act lingered in the stench of curing hides. Stars began vanishing. First Orion, his belt dimming to a smudge. Then Pleiades, their silver tears swallowed by the void. Astronomers blamed haze, sailors cursed faulty charts, but Xenophanes knew. He stood in the grove, watching the last of Sirius gutter out, its light snuffed like a candle in a god's tomb. The moon, stripped of Selene's touch, hung inert, a scarred rock, its seas of dust unmoving. The poet's mind fractured. He ate olives until his gums bled, slept in the grove's roots, and carved Leander's spirals into his thighs. When villagers found him, he was laughing, his fingers tracing constellations only he could see. They bound him in a shepherd's hut, its walls daubed with dung and ash. By morning he was gone, the door intact, his shackles rusted shut. In Alexandria, a librarian stumbled upon Xenophanes' charred epic in a waste pile. The parchment was scorched, but the blood ink endured. He transcribed it, labeling it rural folklore, anonymous, 4th century BCE. Copies spread to Rome, where it was dismissed as barbaric ramblings. to Persia, where a Zoroastrian priest wove its motifs into fire rituals, to a Celtic druid who hummed its verses while sacrificing stags to unnamed gods. The grove's oil reached the sea. Fishermen netted mackerel with scales like polished onyx, their eyes reflecting symbols no living man had carved. When grilled, the flesh tasted of salt and sorrow, and those who ate it dreamt of wolves with galaxies in their pelts. Leander's knife resurfaced in a Macedonian tomb, clutched by a skeleton draped in moth-eaten wool. Archaeologists declared it a ritual blade, its bronze edge too dull for combat. A conservator scrubbed the hilt, erasing the last traces of Leander's sweat. The knife toured museums, displayed beside Achilles' fake shield and Helen's forged comb. Schoolchildren sketched it, their crayons flattening its spirals into harmless squiggles. One night, during a blackout, the knife vanished. Guards found the case unbroken, the alarm silent. The curator resigned, citing stress. In the grove, a sapling split through Leander's ribcage. Its bark bore symbols no blade had etched, its olives sweet as forgiveness. Villagers avoided it, but birds feasted freely, their songs weaving new myths into the wind. A girl, her hair wild as Medusa's, pressed her ear to the trunk. She heard no heartbeat, no whispers, only the creak of growth, patient and vast. When she returned at dawn, her mother found her asleep beneath the tree, a smile carved into her lips. The fates did not stir, the stars did not reignite, the gods did not return. But in the grove, something hummed. The gods dissolved like salt in rain, their essence seeping into the cracks of mortal minds. What remained were not deities but echoes. Zeus in the crackle of summer storms, Hera in the sting of betrayal, Athena in the glint of a scholar's eyeglass. The fates' shears rusted, their final snip lost to the wind. Yet the tapestry endured, rewoven by calloused hands and ink-stained fingers. Mortals inherited a world stripped of divine scripts. They built museums over temples, penned epics on parchment instead of stone, and carved new myths into olive trunks and nursery rhymes. The grove where Leander's bones fed the soil hummed with a truth older than Olympus. Stories outlived their tellers. In the quiet spaces, the creak of a museum statue, the bitter tang of an olive, the flicker of a child's campfire tale, the echoes lingered. Not as gods, but as questions. Not as answers, but as seeds.